So now, I have the wonderful honor to present my colleague, my fellow co-editor, my friend, John Briere, who is the Associate Professor in the Departments of Psychiatry and Psychology at the Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California, and Director of the USC Adolescent Trauma Training Center, National Child Traumatic Stress Network.
It's pretty emblematic of my stumbling way through the universe that the title here you saw probably a few minutes ago was Synthesis of Buddhist and Western Approaches to Trauma in 18 minutes. And then a very nervous convener pointed out to me, actually, I had 45 minutes. So I did the only thing you could do under those circumstances. I edited the screen.
There will be questions?
There will be questions. For some reason, it reminds me that recently I was teaching a course in mindfulness for therapists, and I fell off my cushion in front of everybody. I don't know why I'm telling you that. But obviously, we're talking about a flawed vessel here, but flaws are good. So what I don't want to do here, actually, is the way that this slide sort of implies I will do things, which is to be very critical of Western psychological approaches to trauma. We're not going to really talk about trauma because it's sort of an assumption here. It's already been mentioned to some extent. People like me have spent many years studying it, but in some sense it's kind of an obvious notion. Western approaches to trauma have been very complex and sometimes antagonistic over the last certainly several hundred years. The last 15, 20, 30 years have seen sort of a revolution in our understanding of what trauma might actually represent, and the arising notion of complex trauma, which is where most of us are these days, which is it's not that helpful just to focus on a single adverse event that happened to someone. That thing has many impacts. I work in torture and sex trafficking and stuff. I'm not going to in any way say that what happens with a specific person, a specific event, is not horribly dysregulating and all those kinds of things and painful. But the reality is, of course, for many of us, we've lived lives of difficulties. We've experienced neglect or rejection or abandonment or social oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, harsh parents, all kinds of things that kind of meld together and create an interesting problem, I think, for the Western world. It's also true everywhere else, but I've been around the Western world a little longer, which is that you can't convince fish that there's water. You really can't, in some ways, convince those of us who breathe the noxious environment of depredation and injury that's very much associated with the Western culture without, at some point, feeling like that's normative. You know, very common statement that I hear from residents is, well, why did she go back to that jerk? You know, so it's that kind of a notion, well, I need to know that she needs to leave that jerk. Why is she still with this abusive person? You know, it almost gets tiresome to say a million times that you're talking from this reality, that woman's talking from a reality in which going back to that jerk is a perfectly reasonable way to be, given the world that she's lived in, the lessons she's learned from her childhood and from her culture, the models of the roles of men and women in our culture, etc. So the why doesn't she leave that jerk is almost a useless question. So it's not totally useless, but certainly framed that way, it's not too helpful. The reality is that we are steeped in this very complex world wherein the clinicians who try to help the hurt people breathe the same air that the hurt people experienced, and most of us clinicians have a significant amount of trauma ourselves. So this sort of dualism of the therapist and the client, the traumatized, the non-traumatized person, may break down a little bit in a world where, in fact, there's huge amounts of violence. And if you do sort of a micro-analysis of the average day of the average person, there's all kinds of small micro-traumas, ways in which we're being oppressed and controlled, and ways in which we oppress and control others that are reflected in our very use of language and the relationship of us to our Labrador retrievers or our partner or our kid, or the notion that I said our partner, our kid. So there's so much built into this that makes it very interesting to critique a Western analysis of what Western culture is both promulgating and steeped in simultaneously. I don't actually remember the cartoon because even I'm not that old, but apparently there was an old Pogo cartoon. Do you remember? You ever heard of Pogo? This guy was kind of an interesting guy, but he wrote some very interesting cartoons, and in one of them, Pogo raises his finger and says, "We have met the enemy, and they are us." Well, there isn't really an enemy here, but maybe we've met the survivor, and they are us. And maybe we've met the perpetrator, and they are us too. This gets a lot of us in a lot of trouble when we start talking about perpetration being part of the normal human condition too, because of course we want to partition those people off and make them different so that we can kill them or throw them away and not have to see the reflections of their behavior in our own experience as well. So this is obviously a very complex thing. And what I wouldn't want to do therefore is say, oh, those stupid Western clinicians, they sure do dumb stuff, because I'm a Western clinician and I do dumb stuff, but I'm not sure I would want to use that paintbrush on all my colleagues. So if you sort of want to look at what might be problematic in some cases, and by the way, you notice I use the word traditional Western because there are many, many varieties of psychotherapeutic or clinical interventions for hurt people. I mean, it's ridiculously large. It ranges from psychoanalysis to play therapy to exposure therapy to cognitive processing therapy to interpersonal therapies to the eclectic mix that we bring to our clients on a daily basis. There's a million different ways to do this. So it's just like sometimes when I'm lecturing on gender roles and issues, I sort of imply that everybody's doing one thing or another, inhabiting one gender role or another. And that's very silly, of course, because we're a mixture of all those things. But it's still maybe a little bit helpful just to reflect on some of these things. Perhaps one of the biggest ones that's a problem for us, and maybe a little bit of the thing we trip over, is that our central notion as clinicians, and hopefully I'll come back to this later, and I actually never know where I will end up, which is the notion that we have been trained to fix people, to help people, to liposuction their distress out of their experience so that they can walk around and hopefully be where they were before they were hurt. But there's a lot of stuff built into that analysis that may be to some extent problematic. But I don't know about you guys, but when I knock on that door, I'm constantly fascinated by the automatic conflict of being a, quote, healer, someone who's supposed to promote growth, someone who's supposed to fix people, all of which are notions you're not acceptable as you are right now. What we're going to do is do stuff to you. And when we do stuff to you, then you'll be better, and that will reflect on our amazingness that we were able to help you in these ways. If you have the common courtesy to improve in my presence, then that gains great ego resources for me, and I can go on and be happy as I work with the next person. And there's some sweetness in that. It's not all really rotten. I mean, when I really am in a big psychological problem or have some big medical problem, I don't want someone to just like groove with where I'm at, man. I want them to kind of help me. The Dalai Lama said that too. You know, you talk about all this stuff, but if I have a heart attack, I'm going to an ICU right now, you know. So I think it's sort of like we need to know when to hold them and we need to know when to fold them. Like, when do we do what? And I think it's actually an abrogation of our principles and responsibilities to not try to use whatever we know to help people. But it's almost just a meditation point, isn't it? We're built into the notion that we have to change you to help you. We have to fix your problem, which is very much a Western, primarily medical phenomena that we grafted onto the mental health world. The medical model is you're sick, I, a person of greater power and intelligence, will fix you. And then you can go back to where you were. But what's interesting, of course, is I hope I'll mention later, is we're not going to say, I'll fix you and then you can experience the world in a more real way. It's like, you know, if you spend 4 years with me in intensive psychotherapy, I can get you back to 80% of where you were before that bad thing happened to you. That's a very cramping perspective. And maybe you don't live in that perspective. I've noticed you all seem very happy with what you do. That's really wonderful. I happen to work in the psychiatric system. And in those systems, of which I'm a perpetrator, but in those systems, the notion is we can just give you the drug, the interpretation, the exposure experience, the therapeutic relationship. We just inject 14 units of that in your left buttocks, you'll be just fine. But you'll be just fine. You won't rock the boat. You'll go back to your neighborhood, and you'll buy a car, usually because if you buy a car, then people will like you more. So there's built into this some kind of a notion that that's very nice, you've stepped forward, we fix you, now go back where you came from, which is not actually where we probably want to lead ourselves or where we want to go. In contrast to this notion of fixing people and the implication of that, which is that if you need to be fixed, you must have something wrong with you, we might look at that differently. But let's just think about that. If I'm a clinician, a therapist, therefore you must be a therapy, and a therapy must have someone who needs treatment, therefore you must be undergoing some kind of process that is problematic for you, that if we could just fix it, you'd be better off than you were before. Is it not a premise of your clinical training? And ironically, you're all rebels, aren't you? Because you started out that way and then you find yourself here. But part of the notion here is just do we have the capacity ourselves to accept the experience of the people that we're working with and to foster their own acceptance of their experience, with acceptance in this case meaning not trying to fix it or change it. And it's interesting that Carl Rogers basically said, probably some of you could quote the quote better than me, it's interesting that I could only change when I fully accept myself. Because they seem to be antithetic, right? I mean, isn't it almost an oxymoron to say acceptance therapy? Because if you really did, why would you need that? So there's some baggage that comes with the helping dynamic. And, again, we do the helping dynamic. It's not that we want to throw the whole thing away, but I think we want to think of some of the underlying notions. One of them clearly is that if you feel bad, you should do something about it. That's what we call it bad. If you feel distress, if you feel something that doesn't feel excellent in you, then you should somehow stop that experience from happening. That's not entirely completely wrong relative to exploring the roots of suffering, right? But what we probably mean in these instances is more like, how can you avoid either the thing that caused the pain, or can you avoid your awareness of the pain? And I think the second one is probably the better deal in terms of the message that's being sold in Western culture. Not even just in psychological interventions, but in medications. One of the big secrets that we keep for medical students and residents, although I sometimes try to leak it out, is that psych meds don't work. No, they really don't work. I mean, if you just look at the treatment outcome data, this is true, that basically all psych meds are palliative, that if you take a med, for while you're taking it, it'll change your biochemical environment, and that may alter some da-da-da, and then that. Okay, you may say, well, I'm repopulating my missing cells in a certain memory area of my brain or something. But in reality, mostly an antipsychotic works when you're taking the antipsychotic. Of course, the minute you take the antipsychotic, you're not the same person you were before. And there's a trade-off there that's very interesting. So whether we're talking about a benzo or an SSRI or SNRI or one of the newer antipsychotics or whatever it is, even that notion, which I don't know how much you have to knock on that door, but some of us have to knock on that door a lot, even that very notion is saying there's a huge trade-off here. And one of the trade-offs is, and if my family member has an acute psychotic episode, I want them to have those medications, but part of the trade-off is you are now so different that we're going to have to shut everything down. So being shut down, of course, is a very complex deal about how much do you want to be shut down? A lot of people who are psychotic don't want those meds because they'd rather be psychotic than numbed and dead. Very interesting issue. Our assumption, a la different versions of yoga yesterday too, is do we fix you for your own good, or do you get to decide that? So one of the basic ideas here may be something that I'm trying to write about with no success whatsoever, something that could be referred to as the pain paradox. And the pain paradox is that very, very simply and inappropriately elementary statement of it would be that if we avoid pain, it increases pain, and if we engage pain, it decreases pain. Actually, we probably discriminate pain from suffering and say some other things about that. But the reality probably is that if we try to push upsetting thoughts out of our mind, we will get what some of us call the suppression effect. This is Wegner's work and other people's work showing that if you try to not think about what you're thinking about, it doesn't actually make it go away. What it does is it puts it back in some place you can't really experience. But the process is still running. You're still thinking everything that you were thinking before. All that suppression of thought does is not let you know that you're thinking about what you're thinking about. So the problem with a culture that tells you, just get over your pain, put your past behind you, etc., is it's telling you, utilize your suppressive capacities so that you don't have access to the fact that the trauma is still running in you. And if you are aware of the trauma, use some kind of an avoidance strategy to keep from being totally aware of it. But the problem, as Wegner and others have pointed out, is when you do that, you get that boing effect, as I like to technically call it, which is, Wegner called it the hypersuppression, and then the hyperavailability of suppressed material. So in other words, the problem is when you push it, if you're all day long you're worried about your medical diagnosis you're going to get next week, you may think you're doing fine, but Wagner's showing you're actually thinking about it the whole time. But secondly, the problem is when you suppress material, it's hyper available. It can be triggered very, very easily by a wide variety of circumstances. And when it is suppressed, and when it is retrieved in that way, inadvertently retrieved, it tends to come back unpredictably and with greater severity. Ask anybody with post-traumatic stress disorder, or anyone who's in deep denial but acting out in major ways, every dissociated substance abuse survivor who's having sex with anything that moves. These are my people. These people are people who are having to make all kinds of deals just to maintain any kind of homeostasis, but the deal that they make is they shut everything down. And the culture says, right on you, right on, that's very good, you just do that. The only problem is you look a little sick, so we may have to fix you a bit, but we appreciate the sentiment. Suck it up. I actually saw a new John Wayne commercial. I thought that guy was finally gone. So the pain paradox says don't suck it up, because actually if you suck it up, that'll just bring it back more. And then the flip side is to invite your pain to tea, right? The flip side is to say, actually the way out of distress is to engage distress. And it's so easy for us to say that. But on Tuesday I'll be sitting with a homeless guy who's hearing voices telling him that da-da-da-da-da, who's doing drugs, who's got hepatitis C and HIV, and is homeless and marginalized and is very hungry and nobody likes him. He has no social network. And he's sitting in there trying to get admitted so he has a place to stay, which is really a sign of a low need state if you're actually wanting to be admitted to LA County emergency system as a place to stay. Really saying something. So what do I say to this guy? You know what, Fred, really the deal is just go with your feelings, man. Just get into your marginalization, your terror, your horror, your pain, your suffering. Get into all that stuff, dude, because you will be so much better later. Trust me on this. Oh, and if it takes you a while, that's okay. I'm going home in my car, but I'll be back tomorrow. You just tell me how it's going. This happens all the time. Some of you know, actually, it really pisses me off when people say that pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. Well, screw you. For many people, suffering is not optional at all. The roots of suffering are way outside of their control. They don't get to turn those buttons. They don't press those buttons, turn those knobs. They have to live in the world that they're experiencing. So it's not an unalloyed, wonderful thing to tell people they need to engage their pain. But whether you're talking about exposure therapy or uncovering therapies or just about any kind of intervention you think about nowadays that deals with trauma, part of it's going to be about, I'm really sorry, but you need to go back. I mean, that really sucks. It's such a horrible, mean thing in a way, especially when you put it that way, especially in a culture that tells you not to do this stuff, that if you've been hurt, the only way we know for you to get less hurt, and again, we're back in the fixing domain, is for you to re-engage the pain and experience it as directly as you can, but as safely as you can, until something changes. That's really bad news. And for most of the people that I see who tend to be in lower socioeconomic strata with lots and lots of stressors and a lot of other stuff on board, that stuff sounds very weird to them. It makes no sense at all. But we have to reset our cognitive apparatus, right? We have to say, okay, I appreciate that's hard, but there's a truth here. And the truth is in Buddhist cosmology, it's in parts of Western psychology, and it basically says that if you avoid, the outcomes are worse. And if you accept and embrace, the outcomes improve. It's such a hard thing to... How about for your own personal life? I mean, we go around saying that stuff, but then we use all these avoidance strategies myself. I actually was consulting to a group of people who work with substance abusers, and I really heard it was adorable, so please don't think I'm saying something mean. This guy said, you know what, working with those substance abusers all day long, it freaks me out. If it wasn't for that Chardonnay when I got home... So almost all the things we used, whether it's dissociation or food or sex or distraction through watching little boxes that send out electromagnetic spectra or whatever it is that we do, all of those things are the deal with the devil that we're making on a daily basis, with the proviso that there's no devil, which is that we are trying to make an accommodation to the pain that we feel by using strategies to keep from hurting. But where does the pain come from? It's inevitable from some perspectives, but it also comes from the very culture that's grinding out survivors at a very massive rate. So ironically, the culture that hurts you wants you to put it away and be quiet, because if you made noise, then that would focus attention back on the hurtful dynamic that created the problem in the first place. So if we don't avoid adversity, if we don't deal with the stress that way, how else could we be? When we say embrace, that's very hard. When we say that that trauma is an opportunity, you know, don't ever say that to a person. You say that to your colleagues, but don't say it to a person. But it can be an opportunity. I work in a burn unit a half a day a week. This is a Category 1 burn unit. That means 30 to 60% body surface, full thickness burns, mass disfiguration, amputations, and those kinds of things. I mean, should they embrace their experience? Yeah. I got to tell you, yeah. But what are we asking them? I, a non-burn person, am asking you to embrace that stuff. It's very, very complicated. And of course, the thing is that happens to you, the harder it is to embrace it or accept it. And maybe, and I think I see it sometimes, at some levels it's so bad that you can't actually, I mean, it's so sad. I mean, maybe I just don't know. I know I don't know enough. Maybe there is a way that you're going to be able to accept where you're at. But, you know, you were an 18-year-old young woman who was accessing current measures of acceptability in terms of your cosmetic prettiness and the fact that people wanted to rub up against you and secrete substances which made you sexy, and that your body parts were all just right, and your lipid distribution was perfect, and your eye distance was just right, and the spectral analysis of your irises was excellent, and then a burn happens, and now people can't tell you whether you're a male or a female because your face has actually been that burned. Your left arm has been destroyed. Your breasts have to be reconstructed. You can't walk anymore. Maybe when the paramedics pulled you out of the car, they made a little hole in the back of your head by accident. Maybe now you can't really remember things so much as you were before. Now, I'm sorry, but everything has changed in those situations, and it's going to be very easy for us to go, and I talk to people who are on the cutting edge of severe trauma, therapists, workers, physicians saying you should have died. That's the thing that comes up in your head when you see these things. But that's just an avoidance strategy for us, right? Well, we're really saying, I mean, we're being compassionate, but what we're saying is you could die so that I wouldn't have to see just how bad things actually are and what the roots of suffering really are, because the things that made you be happy as a person, a lot of them were crapola. They came from a culture that said if you look this way and you were these ways, then people would respond to you these ways that will not actually be that satisfying for you, because due to impermanence, even if you are an 18-year-old woman with perky breasts and really great eyes, that's going to change, right? So even if the system's selling you this, if you're a male, you're supposed to be a productive member of the family, and you're supposed to make a lot of money and be really competent, you're going down, right? There's going to be a heart attack. There's going to be a retirement party. There's going to be whatever. You know, these are very transient things, but the culture keeps telling us we have to hang on to them. I work in LA. Being a trauma specialist in LA means you work with the entertainment industry. No, seriously. Everybody's getting stuff sucked out of one part of their body and injected into another part of their body. And the desperation is massive. 28-year-old women saying, I got to get this stuff fixed because I'm getting too old. So that's the systems we're doing that to ourselves, but that's the model of understanding of what's good or bad that comes back and bites you. So even if you were pretty before you were burned, pretty is such a transient notion, and it's such a questionable notion. It's such a weird notion, actually. And it comes back to really evolutionary things about, you know, how you look maybe has something to do with whether your fetus will be viable and whether you will be able to sustain that child through the first years of life. Nothing that has to do with what we call sexy or interesting. So a real dynamic for every trauma therapist I've ever met, certainly for myself, is when I look at you and you are in such pain, 99 times out of 100, I can't fix that pain. But I have a manual, right? I've got a manualized treatment that I could try to use. I've got a diagnosis I can give. I give a diagnosis, then I get to separate myself from you because you now have a diagnosis, whereas I'm a licensed psychotherapist. Right? So the minute that we do that, although I teach diagnosis, I don't want to lie to you, but diagnosis is a distancing device in many ways. It has, you know, once you say that your client's a borderline, it's like, God, for a while there, she really had me going. But now that I know she's a borderline, it's her problem, man. And if she's so screwed up that she's not psychologically available to my brilliance, well, that's her problem. So we have all kinds of things we can try to do to mess with the data, but in many cases, we just have to sit with people's pain. And are we very good at that? Let me tell you, I don't know why I'm telling you this, especially since he just told me 20 minutes already, but I was meditating last night, and I thought that I was going to go to sending compassion to the various things that are going on in the world right now about suffering. And I cannot even tell you why, and you probably, but I suddenly was thinking about a deer who'd been shot by a hunter who had not been killed by the bullet. And this happens a lot. I don't know if you know this, but so the deer goes charging into the woods, and the hunter, if they're ethical, they try to chase him down and kill him so they don't have to suffer. And my mind, I'm actually getting choked up, very pathetic. My mind actually is going back to that poor deer who just 20 minutes ago was eating roots and berries or whatever, and it was da-da-da-da-da, Bambi land. Not really, probably he was saying, geez, my bum hurts, I got some parasite back there, I really can't stand. But you know what I'm saying? And then suddenly, bam, a bullet pierces that poor guy's intestinal tract. It's going to take him hours to die. And my meditation was following that guy, and it was dragging me. I wasn't dragging it through the bushes, dying in horrible pain. And what would a deer be thinking when that's happening? Yeah. Well, why is that relevant here, other than apparently I needed to talk about it? Is that you can't fix that deer, especially as the person sitting in the nice little B&B, right? You can't do anything about that. So what do we want to do? We want to change the channel, right? In meditation, you want to move to something else. I'll pay attention to my breathing. This would be a good time to orient myself to the, but actually, that's where I need to be. And where I found myself last night was making myself stay with that deer for like 5 minutes. Is that not our job in a weird way? Except that the deers are us, right? We're the same people that have the trauma who are trying to help the trauma. But sometimes we actually have to just sit in some other place. And there's nothing in medicine or Western psychology that helps us out in that regard. Some of the humanists, maybe a little bit, before the advent of mindfulness and more contemplative perspectives, if you work in a major medical center, you see a lot of pissed off surgeons. And one of my best friends is a burn surgeon. But why are they so pissed off? Because they've been trained how to fix people, but some people refuse to let themselves to get fixed, or they die anyway. I've actually seen physicians pissed off at their patients for dying. It's like, don't you understand what's on the line here? Now, that's kind of mean to say it that way, but do you know what I mean? Like that they're trying to pursue the infinite with a finite vehicle. There ain't no scalpel that's going to fix this problem. So you end up being pissed off, and then you get really abrasive with others and charge too much for your services. So we want to fix things. We want to make them better. But in fact, in many cases, what we should probably be doing is seeing if we can provide an environment where the individual may get to a place where that is more helpful than the place they already were. But that doesn't sound very clinical, does it? So that involves honoring the person. I often seem to make some people nervous when I say that I feel honored that the traumatized person wants me to be in the same room with them. I think it feels a little tiny bit incestuous or something, or like I'm getting some weird thing out of it. But it is honor. It's the literal notion that you've been invited into this terrible, traumatic, fascinating, compelling, roots of suffering reality, and you get to existentially live in that experience, but you're not experiencing it like, oh, this is so awesome. What you're doing is actually inhabiting, without invading, the experience of another person and sitting actually with that stuff. And in that process, I think we do become Buddhists. Because there's nowhere else to run to, is there? There is a place to run to, just don't do that, right? Oh, that guy's too bad, I'm not going to work with him. Oh, my meditation has a wounded deer. Well, I think I'll meditate on lotuses. Okay. I mean, there are places to go, but if you do take it's not really a challenge, but if you do allow ongoing experience to knock on your door, where it's going to lead you to has to be something about like where we're here today. So this creates an interesting challenge for those of us who are open to other ways of thinking, but are also still enmeshed in this you're sitting here all Buddha-like, oh, it's very cool. I think you guys really look great, but you probably are going to have to code a DSM diagnosis or fill out an insurance form or something, and then who are you then? Who's that person? Well, actually, that person's just you and everything's fine, but what's interesting is that's all mixed up in our daily work, right? Every time that we think that you think you're really, in a great place, and then you refer to someone as borderline. The whole diagnosis of borderline personality disorder is an externalization device. I mean, and I work directly in that area and do research and statistical analyses of the structure of borderlinehood and all those things. I mean, I know there are ways people can be that are very problematic for themselves and others, but our labels usually are distancing devices. They're industrially approved dissociative techniques that allow us to not be present with that poor wounded deer. And not even to think the wounded deer is poor, right? Because if we show pity for the deer, that's the near enemy of compassion, right? Compassion would be that we would be the deer too, which we are. So poor us, man, no wonder we're having such a hard time. Luckily, we have joy, happiness, and endorphins. Then another real basic problem here is going to be the idea of whose agent are we? There is a way in which every time that someone is hurt, every time someone is crazy, every time someone kills someone, every time someone cuts in their arm or burns their inner leg, what they're doing is providing an indictment of the system. They're saying, it really hurts out there. These things have happened to me. Why do we have all these national outcries when somebody's phone camera catches a person of color being beat up by a white police officer? Why do we get so mad? You know, it's sort of like, I didn't know that was going on. Good God, how long has this been going on? Does this occur in other places too? Oh no, it's a local perturbation. No, I don't know. I mean, why do we have, you know, the reality is the status quo sucks. I don't mean in big sucks. I mean, we're all part of it, and I did like this shirt when I bought it. But, you know, when the Buddha talked about going against the stream, what was he actually saying? If it was the Buddha, and, you know, we get all these problems here. You know, who said what? And this Buddha guy had some ideas, and then like 6 generations of guys wrote stuff down. Now, which he asked him not to do anyway. I mean, like, I think when he was dying, he said, hey, guys, don't write this down. And don't make no statues. Yes, sir. Got it. You know, part of the masculinist influence in mental health and in Buddhism is not just the violence and oppression that's more associated with the male role than the female role. It's also the entire perspective of how you see things. So the fact that Buddhism has actually been transmitted through male minds for multiple generations before it was turned into something that impacted and allowed women is very meaningful. I mean, don't you feel bad for Buddha's female relative following behind the camp going, me too, me too, me too? You know, and Buddha was saying, no, I'm sorry, no men allowed. Do you remember that? Well, you don't remember it, but have you heard about that? And then Ananda, Buddha's personal assistant, said, hey, dude, let her in. No, I can't do that. You know, now, Buddha did allow her in, but she had more precepts. She still has them, right? And many more rules. So in many traditions. And I don't want to get into this too deep because it's another source of getting into trouble. But there is a quality of masculinity in many of these models that produces the very problems we're trying to think about, which have to do with separation, individuation, diagnosis, treatment, fixing hands-on, which, you know, if you want to build a bridge, I'd have a guy do it. Except maybe not necessarily, but sure, but if you want to have something understood, it may not be that the classic guy analysis is going to be the way to go with this. I just say that. I'm just saying that, okay? I mean, I'm not like, don't hurt me later, okay, guys? Yeah. So it may be that it's heretical to be a Buddhist. I think it is. So if you're just wearing your beads because it looks nice on you and it's a nice color, that's fine. I think that's adorable, but that's not what this is about. This is about actually people going, what's that on your arm? Right? Is that not, you know, that's a weird red string. What do you call that thing, as my father-in-law said to me? What do you call that thing? You know, I call that, I'm weird. Right? I mean, you look fine now with your beads, right? But you go to like a fancy dinner. What's that on your wrist? You know, you could say that the beads are to remind you of your endeavor, but it's also, I think, to remind us that we are not part of the stream. We're not part of the regular deal. That there's something very radical about this perspective that says we need to challenge. We don't need to accept, in the notion of acceptance, seeing, to accept the storyline, to accept that this is the way that it actually has to be. And then this whole self thing, don't get me started, right? As someone who both lectures to Buddhist audiences and psychotherapists, this drives me crazy because I actually believe with both sides. And so I therefore beat myself up a lot. Sometimes I cut on myself. I've never told anyone it's been. Because we are so oriented around the self-psychology, right? Affect regulation skills, self-capacities. We have all these things that locate certain functions and models, et cetera, inside of you. Bless you, there's only one slight problem. There doesn't appear to be a you. So then, if what we're trying to do is strengthen your ego and sense of self, we are in some sense trying to help you with something that cannot be assisted. What it could probably do is teach you to develop a more powerful delusional system, and which may be a benefit to you in this culture. And you know, if I'm seeing a massively hurt sexual abuse survivor who actually believes she has no entitlement and who doesn't have any sense of the rights to not be invaded, who can't really localize any internal her so that when she's around people, she's very easily thrown off course because there's no internal topography for her to access to figure out what's going on here, how can I be? She doesn't have self-confidence, self-assurance, etc. I do believe that that's something that we may want to see what we can do with. Hey, man, it can't be 5 minutes. I'm just on the second slide. So the what?
Well, Western versus Eastern.
No. Eastern, Schmeastern. No, forget that stuff. So the notion of self is very complicated here, right? And it comes up all the time. Could we also say that there's aspects of Buddhist psychology, one way or another, that can be helpful in working with trauma survivors? And we have to tiptoe gently through these tulips, because the problem, again, is what? That when it's like taking in Freudian analysis. Freud said some brilliant stuff. He also said it in 1890 in a culture that was horribly misogynist. He had his own issues with his dad and his sister, and you know, I don't know if you've heard about that stuff. Oh my God. And he wrote all these ideas, which were a great idea then, but they reflected not only his culture, but his experience. And so he had little ideas that may have been a little wrong term, like women make up abuse stories because they really want to have sex with their dads. You know, slight little errors. But he tried, right? He tried to say that it was sexual abuse, and he got so much grief from the system that he came up with this second model that women were asking for or fantasized about. But nevertheless, Freudian analysis has many important, helpful things. As someone who's been through analysis, admittedly through a contemporary analytic person, but been through analysis can help you in many, many ways. But, you know, you have to, it's like Robert Frost said, I want to know what I'm fencing in and what I'm fencing out. You want to know what you can take in of this doctrine and what can you not. The minute that mindfulness hits Western psychology, it runs into trouble. What's the most basic way it runs into trouble? What is the primary goal of mindfulness for a true Buddhist non-psychologist practitioner? It probably is a spiritual goal, right? It's probably a discernment goal. It's probably something else. For the average American, why do you go to MBSR? To feel better. Frankly, a lot of people in the traditional deal don't care if you feel better or not. They want to know about your spiritual journey. In fact, if you feel good, that might take you off the path, right? Because you might have bought false goods in a way. You might have said, oh, I'll settle for this, instead of trying to confront what that stuff is about. So we have to be careful in this regard. But one of the first things, and actually Gurman and Siegel both being in the front row, I really liked their writing when I first encountered it, around the notion that mindfulness is exposure. That in a weird way, every time we sit on the cushion or every time that we try to invoke this contemplative capacity to turn inward is a time when we open ourselves up to experience as opposed to fighting off experience. Every time we do that, for the trauma survivor, what's going to come in is their life, is their history, is their background. Which is why, by the way, you've probably heard this, maybe you're very involved in it, we now screen people more than we used to for trauma survivors who are wanting to access mindfulness. Because for some people, you know, it's not yet the right time for them to do that. They may need a more loving kindness approach, first of all. They may need some other intervention or yoga or something, a trauma-sensitive yoga especially. They may need that before they're going to start experiencing the contents of their minds. Right? So, because what's in there is pain. But to the extent to which we can do that, every time that we allow, we're going to allow experience, which means we're going to experience distress, but we're going to do it in this very interesting container, where there's no actual danger at the moment, and where we at least transiently have these extra supports and protections. Meditation, mindfulness can also be cognitive therapy. The very notion of metacognitive awareness, as some of our colleagues have termed it, the very notion that we could develop the capacity to know that just because we think something or feel something or remember something doesn't mean it's true. All it is a product of the mind. It may be true, like when we're working with inner city kids and they go, what do you mean that might be true? That dude is trying to kill me. You go, good point. So it's not that metacognitive awareness says avoid the production zero mind. It just says know that that's what it is. And then what happens in this context is a very powerful cognitive intervention. That's why mindfulness-based cognitive therapy has been so successful, I believe, is that it allows you to change your relationship to your experience. Of course, who's changing the relationship and where are you outside of the experience is a very interesting question. But it allows us to do that. So that metacognitive awareness becomes a very powerful cognitive device, trying to understand the roots of why you feel the way you do, either from a more dharmic perspective or a more family-based perspective. Why are these things arising in you? What do they mean? This is to some extent a mindfulness task. Obviously, mindfulness is used a lot for affect regulation training. It's almost sad that it gets called that very easily now. Affect regulation is just your relative ability to sort of chill, to not be overwhelmed by painful internal experience, to be able to down-regulate distress when you've been sitting in it without using avoidance, just being able to. Those are Buddhist deals. So we have settling skills. How can you actually calm yourself down, whether it's a polyvagal thing or whether it's a more classic meditation or whatever it is, or breathing exercise, whatever you want to call it, wherever you go with that. Part of the notion, one of the benefits of meditation is that it does calm you down eventually, if you're lucky, on Tuesdays. So for a hyper-aroused trauma survivor, that's awesome to the extent that it can be helpful. I think we overstate the extent it can be helpful, but the extent to which we cannot get tied up in our beliefs and our needs and our expectations that are not based in reality, but are based in what we've been told to believe things are necessary. The things that we've learned we need, like cars and sex partners and that are pretty and whatever the things are, the messages that we have, all that stuff. You know, if you work in a burn unit, one of the things that you have to do right away is work with people's fact that what's been burned in some sense are all of their hopes. All of the false beliefs they had about how they were going to turn out, what their family was going to be like, the job they were going to have, the kids they were going to have. They may be able to have those things, but it's no guarantee anymore. This is where chaos can be growth-producing, but it's also where chaos can slap you in the face, right? So this notion of, a lot of times that's hard to explain this to residents and other people, but it may be the therapy with a severe burn survivor is this notion of what are you attached to and what else is there? So in other words, the fact that you can't do X because of Y may not mean that all is bad. It may just mean that X may not be in your future, but maybe something else is. We're all accidents waiting to happen. I work in emergency services. I see people who 1 second they're fine, and then they are what we call not fine. You know? And that's all that could happen to me on the way home. I'm going to throw a clot or something, aren't you? Something's going to happen. You know, this is really very transient, right? This deal that's going on. So part of what, you know, it's a bummer to realize that, and I think that's the first step, is that sometimes it's distressing to have a more broad understanding, but it's also protective, because if you believe that everything's going to work out, then you're going to get hurt. You're going to get messed with in some pretty deep ways. So we do a lot of work with that. And by the way, do you think that's crushing to sit down with a 23-year-old boy who had a whole different model of the universe and talk about what now he can do with one arm whose hand doesn't work anymore? Now, your faces fall because that's your compassionate beings. And that's true, but it's also, we don't want to use that countertransference to define what their future is going to be like, right? We're going to have to figure out some other way to go from there. Urge surfing, I know I'm totally out of time, but this comes from mindfulness-based relapse prevention, but it's in all kinds of areas, which is when needs arise that you want to do things that are bad for you, like drugs or alcohol or cutting yourself or whatever, could you have a more mindful appreciation that urge, too, is just a product of the mind, that it's just an arising experience that's no more important than any other experience, and if you can change your experience of it so that you don't act on it, it's going to live its own life and slowly fade away. Try selling that to a heroin addict. But it's true, and heroin addicts have gained from that model. So, you know, it's very difficult for us. I was going to talk about rain, but I'm not.
What does it stand for? R-A-I-N.
Bad meteorologic conditions where it means that, like, if you get triggered or something, like if, let's say, what I just said, you felt discounted by, I hope you didn't. So then recognition would be to recognize that at that moment that what's happening to you, your arising distress that you think I disrespected you at that moment, is just what it is, that you were in this situation, that you have, as we would say, you actually have been triggered. You're no longer in reality, you're in trigger. Okay. Acceptance or allowing means that you know that that this thing that's happening for you, if you resist it, it's probably going to get worse, and that it's that old pain paradox thing. If you can embrace it, actually probably you're going to go to a different place. I'm going over this way too fast. investigation at the non-spiritual level, which I sometimes recommend, but we have great debates about this. Investigation is, why is this coming up for me? What does this relate to? So if she felt rejected by what I said, is that because when she was little, people didn't take her seriously and it was very hurtful to her, and that is hurtful to people? And is that now being activated? So can she investigate where that's coming from? It could be investigation is more of a Buddhist psychological notion of investigating the roots of that process. And then N is non-identification, although there's other names too, which just basically means, yeah. You know, it comes up, it's something, it's real, but it's only what it is, and it doesn't really say anything about the true state of reality or the true state of who you are, because depending on how much you believe this, you don't really exist in that formulation anyway. It's the realization that now you've gone through these steps and you now feel enraged, or you feel that this is happening, et cetera, and for you to just say, you know, just so. Here it is, but it's only what it is. And then I guess I just want you to read those lines because I don't have the time to talk about it. But basically, we know that the therapeutic relationship is actually the most powerful, effective treatment. They're keeping that a secret from you. The developers of new treatment models are telling you that the new treatment model, whether it's TFCBT or SVP or VDRL, any of those treatments, that somehow if you could just have a specific treatment, you could make people better. But the treatment outcome data, the meta-analysis of the treatment outcome data for the last half a century indicates to us that the best predictor of whether you get, quote, better in therapy is the quality of the relationship. And that's what we can really, because we're in it. The Western version of Buddhism is a very interpersonal version of Buddhism. Again, I think massively assisted by female minds, by the way. I think that's where the relationality of Buddhism really is coming into place in American Western Buddhism, are women contemplatives and other people revising some of these models in some way. So the availability of compassion, not egocentricity in terms of how you relate to your client. Attunement to what's going on in the client because you're mindfully aware of your own experience to some extent and the things that are going on around you. And then this whole notion of what do you do when you have a countertransferential desire to hit your client over the head with a rock, or have sex with them, or call them something like borderline personality disorder. When those countertransferential things come up, what do you do? What's the old idea? Squish them down. What's the problem? Boing, right? So we know actually the suppression of countertransferential states is not going to be your friend. So you probably have to rein it. You have to rein it and rein it and rein it and rein it. You have to figure out where it's coming from. But what's interesting about this is that the metacognitive perspective says, the fact that right now I think you are a so-and-so because I've decided it's due to so-and-so, that's just my mind talking. That's just the monkey chattering. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with actually what's going on in the moment. So some of us are suggesting countertransference may be a classic example where mindfulness is very, very, very helpful. What do we still need to know? Oh man, I'm so over, but I'll do it really quickly. First of all, what have we now got? What's the danger when you suck up to the other side? Which is that now mindfulness has become the new treatment. It's become the new commodified intervention. So it actually, if we're not careful, mindfulness will be stripped of all things connected to anything, especially the Dharma, and what will be left is just another thing. It's another Valium. And sometimes when you're talking to the military's incarnation of mindfulness, it's so divorced from anything that it's just a psychotechnology, which is fine, but we've lost some of the juice of this process, and I think actually the most helpful parts. The extent to which we are existentially aware is the extent to which we're not going to buy into this individuality. We're going to be more focused on inner being. We don't know enough about how to not see ourselves as separate, special, smart, efficacious, and we're not yet able to deal with the side effects of that, which are the desire to exert power, the desire to be authoritarian, which is constantly present in all therapeutic endeavors. You have to watch it constantly, that you're the boss, and how dare they not think that. You say, oh, I don't do that, I'm a liberal. But you do that. I guarantee you do that. So how can we continue to monitor that stuff? Because that translates into violence. It may not be blood, but it's violence. Dependent arising, just the basic notion that all things arise from other things, that we're stuck in vast reciprocating circuits of causality, and there's an infinite number of those things that are affecting every moment. So, in fact, all things are arising from other things, which means it's pretty hard to blame people because it all comes from other places as well. What comes with this does mean, though, that what we tend to believe is because we don't really believe in dependent arising. We believe that you could be evil, there could be something bad about you that causes you to need the death penalty or need to be punished or need to be in restraints or whatever it might be, because we have broken the bounds of inner being. We've decided you are a free will individual who chose to kill that person or do that thing or to hear those voices, and therefore we have to punish you for what you've done, or we have to somehow intervene on you. If I'm not totally boring you by now, if you go to my website, there's an article I wrote for the APA on a Buddhist analysis of evil, trying to look at the role of dependent arising to try to see how we see people as independently bad, as opposed to the notion that all things arise from other things. So anything you see is just a point in a process. It's not independently arising behavior. It's a behavior that is the effect of other things. We can't track it because there's a gazillion separate things in the universe that are affecting anything that's happening to us. So we call it free will, and this is where I could lose some of you, and have in the past. But I don't actually believe in free will, which pisses off therapists, because therapists, our industry is free will. But I'm not sure what would free will be, and who's the person being free? Who's the independent agent that can be free in free will? And why would we miraculously suddenly be free of what affects everybody? How could you not be the result of your childhood and your culture and all those experiences? You say, oh, but this little bit, this smidgen, that's free will. It might be, but dependent arising doesn't actually suggest that. It's a tremendous thing to give up, and it doesn't mean you have to be fatalistic. But a very important thing I think that we're missing in Western psychology is the notion of separating things into separate little silos, and people are things, and they have their own responsibilities and causalities in a very specific kind of way. If we can start to challenge the notion of free will, or at least think about it, then we may not think that there are bad people, sick people, evil people. We may think that some people have had difficult circumstances which cause them to be in places that they are. I mean everybody. I mean anyone you can think of. The worst, baddest person of all of history, I believe, got there because of causes and conditions. We want to identify Hitler and whoever we're talking about as the bad guy so we can be non-Hitlerian. But it took a lot of people. Otherwise, Hitler would have just been a psychotic house painter. How did it turn out the way that it turned out? Uh-oh, it's really bad when they start moving towards you. So just look at that. Doesn't that look cool? All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.